They say when you become a parent, you'd give up anything for your child. Your time, your money, even your dreams. I believed that. I lived it. But no one tells you that one day, the child you sacrificed everything for might look at you and choose someone else instead. This Christmas, my son told me he couldn't make it home. And I made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. Christmas has always been our thing. Not the kind you see in glossy ads with matching sweaters and perfect smiles, but our own messy, beautiful tradition. We'd burn the cookies, forget the batteries for the toys, and watch the same old movie 3 times because the remote got lost in the couch cushions. I didn't care about the chaos. I cared about the fact that he was there, next to me, laughing at all the wrong parts. But this year, the seat beside me was going to be empty. He called me on a Tuesday evening. I remember because I'd just finished hanging the lights on the porch, the same ones he used to help me untangle every December. His voice sounded rushed, like he was already halfway out the door somewhere else. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry, but I can't come home for Christmas this year. Things are just too busy." No explanation. No plan to reschedule. Just busy. I laughed, trying to make light of it. Busy? What could be more important than your old man's overcooked turkey? But he didn't laugh back. There was a pause, and then the sound of voices in the background. Someone called his name, and he quickly said, "We'll talk soon, okay." And then he was gone. Just like that. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time, the foam still warm in my hand. The twinkling lights from outside cast strange shadows on the walls, making the room feel bigger and emptier. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just missing him this year. I'd been missing him for a while. The last few visits, he was always half on his phone, half somewhere else in his mind. I just hadn't wanted to see it. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in my armchair, staring at the fireplace. The crackling reminded me of when he was a boy, sitting cross-legged in front of the fire, begging me to tell him just one more story before bed. Back then, I was his whole world. Now, I wasn't even on his calendar. Over the years, I'd saved every penny I could for him. Not just in a bank account, but in the form of a future, the house, the land, the business. I told myself it was my duty as a father to make sure he'd never have to struggle the way I did. But as I sat there that night, I began to wonder, what's the point of leaving someone a legacy if they can't even find time for you while you're alive? I thought about calling him back, asking for the real reason he wasn't coming. Maybe it was work. Maybe it was money. Maybe it was something I'd done without realizing. But then I remembered his tone, that mix of guilt and something else. It didn't sound like a problem. It sounded like a choice. The next morning, I went to the attic and pulled down the old photo albums. Page after page, there he was, missing front teeth, grass stains on his jeans, holding up a fishing rod bigger than he was. There were birthdays with lopsided cakes, camping trips where it rained all weekend, and Christmas mornings where his eyes lit up brighter than the tree. I smiled at the memories, but the smile didn't last. Somewhere between those pages and today, we'd lost something. I decided to test him. I sent a text. "If you change your mind, I'll be cooking Christmas dinner at 6. There's always a plate for you." Hours passed. No reply. By nightfall, I'd stopped checking my phone. 2 days later, I overheard something in the grocery store that shifted everything. A woman was on the phone, telling someone about her son who couldn't make it home for the holidays. She laughed and said, "It's fine." I sent his gift to him early. At least he'll have something to open. I realized that was me, the parent who keeps giving, no matter how little comes back. And in that moment, I felt something inside me harden. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was clarity. I'd been living in the shadow of the father I thought I should be, instead of facing the truth of the father I'd become. I was still giving like he was my little boy, but he wasn't. He was a grown man who had made his choice. And now, I was going to make mine. I pulled out my will that night. It had been sitting in the desk drawer for years, untouched. His name was everywhere. The house, the savings, the business. All neatly lined up to be his someday. I stared at it for a long time, then picked up a pen. But I didn't scratch his name out in anger. I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it because I realized I could give my life's work to someone who would actually value it. Someone who might need it more. Maybe it was a charity. Maybe it was a friend who'd been there for me. Maybe it was that young couple down the street who'd been working 2 jobs just to pay rent. Once the thought took root, it grew fast. I started looking at my possessions not as his inheritance, but as pieces of a story I could choose how to end. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control. I wish I could tell you there was guilt in that moment, but there wasn't. There was only a strange, quiet relief. Like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't realize was optional. The next week, I started making changes. I sold the second car. I donated half the furniture I never used. I transferred part of my savings into a trust for the local youth center. Each action felt like peeling away a layer of something stale and replacing it with fresh air. When I finally told my lawyer what I wanted to do with the will, he looked at me over his glasses and said, "You're sure about this? It's a big step." I smiled. I've never been more sure about anything. Christmas Eve came, and I sat by the fire with a cup of cocoa. Outside, snow fell softly over the yard. My phone buzzed. It was a message from my son. "Hey Dad, sorry again. Maybe next year." I stared at the screen for a long time, and then I turned the phone face down. Because by then, I knew. Next year might never come. But I still had this year, and I was done waiting for someone who'd already decided not to show up. The morning after Christmas, I woke up earlier than usual. No hangover, no regret, just the quiet hum of the heater and the soft creak of the house settling in the cold. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the sunlight turn the snow into a glittering sheet. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering whether my son was having a good holiday. I wasn't checking my phone every hour. I wasn't waiting. And that silence, it was oddly peaceful. A week later, I met with my lawyer again. We sat in his small, oak-paneled office, surrounded by books that smelled like old paper and dust. I laid out my final wishes with a confidence that surprised even me. The youth center would get the largest portion, enough to repair the building, buy equipment, and fund scholarships for kids who needed a shot at something better. The rest would go to a few people who had been like family when my own flesh and blood wasn't. My lawyer nodded, scribbling notes. "You understand," he said carefully, "that once this is filed, it's binding." I didn't even blink. "Good," I replied. It's strange, the way you start seeing people differently when you stop expecting things from them. For years, I'd kept my world small, focused on my son as if he were the sun, and I was just revolving around him. But once I broke free from that orbit, I started noticing everyone else. The single mom who always smiled at me at the diner. The old man who shoveled his neighbor's driveway without being asked. The teenagers at the youth center who waved when I walked by. People who gave without measuring what they'd get in return. I started volunteering at the youth center a couple of afternoons a week. At first, I just fixed leaky faucets and replaced light bulbs, but then I got pulled into their chess club. The kids didn't care that I wasn't their dad. They didn't ask me for money. They just wanted to hear my old fishing stories and beat me at chess, which, by the way, they did far more often than I'd like to admit. One afternoon, I overheard 2 boys talking in the corner. One said, "Man, I wish my dad would come to my games." The other replied, "Yeah, mine too." Their voices were so casual, like they'd already accepted it as just how things were. My chest ached in a way I hadn't felt in years. It hit me then. Maybe I wasn't taking something away from my son. Maybe I was giving something to kids who never had it to begin with. Meanwhile, my son and I kept up our bare minimum conversations. A text every week or so. A quick call if he needed advice on his car or his taxes. I never mentioned the changes I was making. I didn't need to. This wasn't about teaching him a lesson anymore. It was about teaching myself one. Still, there were nights when I'd lie awake, wondering if he'd notice the difference when I was gone. If he'd think back to all the times I'd waited for him to show up and realized how many chances he'd wasted. But then I'd shake it off. Regret is a heavy coat to wear, and I wasn't going to put it back on just because it used to fit. Spring came early that year, and with it, a sense of renewal. The youth center held a fundraiser, and they asked me to speak. I told them a cleaned-up version of the truth, how I'd been given more than I could ever use, and I wanted to pass it on to people who would. I left out the part about my son. Some stories don't need every chapter told out loud. It was at that fundraiser that I met Emily, the director of the youth center. She was in her 40s, sharp-minded, with a laugh that carried across the room. She told me about the kids she worked with, how some of them were so hungry they'd take home extra snacks from after-school programs just to feed their siblings. I thought about my own fridge at home, always stocked, and how I used to complain when my son didn't visit to help eat it all. Perspective is a humbling thing. A few weeks later, Emily invited me to a basketball game at the center. The bleachers were packed with parents, siblings, and friends, all shouting encouragement. I sat there, clapping and cheering for kids whose names I'd only learned 5 minutes earlier. It didn't matter. They lit up when they heard someone in the stands calling for them. I couldn't help but think, this is what showing up looks like. Then, one evening in early summer, my phone rang. My son's name flashed on the screen. I answered, expecting another quick question about his car. Instead, his voice was hesitant. "Hey, Dad, listen, I'm thinking about coming up to visit next month." I almost smiled, but I kept my tone even. "That'd be nice," I said. He went on about how work had slowed down and how he missed the old place. I listened, but I didn't rush to fill the silence with reassurance like I used to. When we hung up, I sat there for a while, the phone still in my hand. The old me would have started planning his favorite meals, cleaning the house top to bottom, counting down the days. But now? Now I knew that visits were just visits. The real test was who stood by you when they didn't have a reason to. By the time he did visit, I'd already finalized the will. Everything was in place. I didn't bring it up. Why would I? This wasn't about rubbing salt in a wound. It was about leaving a different kind of mark on the world. One that didn't depend on whether my son ever truly saw me again. That weekend, we shared a few laughs, grilled some steaks, and even watched that same old Christmas movie we used to. For a few hours, it almost felt like the past. But when he left, it was with the same rushed goodbye as always. No promises, no plans. Just, "I'll call you." And I knew better than to wait by the phone. The summer rolled on, filled with games at the youth center, dinners with new friends, and quiet evenings where I didn't feel the need to fill the air with anything but the sound of the crickets outside. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd chosen. And every time I walked past that old will, now locked away in a folder marked final, I felt no guilt, no second guessing. Just a steady, quiet certainty. Because sometimes the bravest thing a father can do is stop giving everything to someone who stopped showing up, and start giving it to those who actually will. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in late August. I was fixing a loose cabinet hinge when my phone rang. This time, it wasn't my son. It was my lawyer. His tone was calm, but I could tell he was choosing his words. "Your son called me today," he said. "Apparently, he heard about the changes you made to your will." I froze, screwdriver still in my hand. "And?" I asked. And he continued, "He's upset. He wants to talk to you." 2 hours later, my son's truck pulled into the driveway. He didn't even bother with the usual small talk. He came straight into the kitchen, eyes sharp. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice tight. I put down the screwdriver and leaned against the counter. "Because it's my decision," I said simply. That didn't sit well with him. "Dad, this is my inheritance. You can't just—" I cut him off. It's not anymore." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. He stared at me like I was a stranger. "After everything I've done for you," he started, but stopped himself. I raised an eyebrow. "Everything you've done for me." My voice was calm, but there was an edge I couldn't hide. "You mean the texts once a month? The missed holidays? The visits that feel like errands?" His face flushed, and for a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be, caught doing something wrong, but not ready to admit it. "That's not fair," he muttered. I crossed my arms. "Fair? Fair is showing up. Fair is making time for people before they're gone." I paused, letting the words settle. "You made your choices, son. Now I'm making mine." He paced the kitchen, his hands running through his hair. "So what? You're just gonna give it all away to strangers?" I shook my head. "Not strangers. People who need it. People who'll value it. People who won't wait until my obituary to realize I mattered." For a while, the only sound was the ticking clock on the wall. Finally, he said, "You're punishing me." I sighed. "No, I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." He didn't like that answer. His jaw tightened, and he grabbed his keys from the counter. "Fine. Do whatever you want. But don't expect me to come around when you change your mind." The door slammed behind him, and I stood there alone in the kitchen, the echo still bouncing off the walls. It hurt, more than I wanted to admit, but it also felt necessary. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors you can choose to open, but sometimes you have to lock them for your own peace. That night, I sat by the fire again. I thought about calling him, smoothing things over, telling him it wasn't about him, even though it was. But I didn't. Because every time I'd done that before, it just reset the cycle. He'd drift away again, and I'd be left holding the rope, pulling him back, exhausting myself in the process. Days passed without a word from him. I filled the time with the youth center, small home projects, and the quiet kind of joy that doesn't need to be announced. Still, in the quiet moments, I'd catch myself wondering what he was thinking. If he was angry, if he was hurt, if he understood it all. One afternoon, Emily stopped by with a basket of fresh bread from the bakery. She stayed for coffee, and we ended up talking about the argument. She listened without interrupting, then said something that stuck with me. Sometimes, love isn't about giving more. It's about giving differently. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew she was right. A week later, I got a text from my son. Just one line. "We need to talk." My first thought was that he'd cooled off, maybe even understood where I was coming from. So when he showed up that evening, I was caught off guard by the look on his face. Not softened, but hardened. He sat down at the table and went straight to the point. "I think you're making a mistake. When you're gone, all that money and property, it's supposed to stay in the family." I sipped my coffee, letting him talk. "You can give to your charities, fine. But taking me out of the will completely, that's crossing a line." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "You want to talk about lines? The line was when you stopped showing up, son. The line was when holidays, birthdays, and dinners became optional. I'm not crossing a line. I'm drawing one." He shook his head, frustrated. "You're acting like I've abandoned you." I met his eyes. "You may not have meant to, but yes, that's exactly what it feels like." I could see my words hit him like a weight. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time in a long while, he didn't have a comeback. We sat there in silence for what felt like an hour. Finally, he muttered, "I don't agree with you." I nodded. "You don't have to. This isn't a debate. It's my life, my choice. He stood up to leave, and this time, the goodbye was softer. No slamming doors. Just a quiet, "See you around, Dad." And maybe, just maybe, there was a flicker of something in his voice. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the start of understanding. The days after that second conversation felt different. Not lighter, not heavier. Just different. Like we had both stepped away from a chessboard mid-game, unsure if we'd ever finish it. I kept myself busy with repairs at the youth center and the little garden out back. Emily teased me that I was growing more tomatoes than one man could eat in a year, but I told her it was for the kids. The truth was, planting something and watching it grow felt like the opposite of what I'd been doing with my son for years. Seeds don't ghost you. They either grow or they don't. A couple of Saturdays later, I was at the diner having my usual black coffee when I saw him walk in. My son. He looked surprised to see me, like he hadn't planned on running into his own father in the same small town we've both lived in for decades. He walked over, hands shoved in his jacket pockets. "Hey, Dad." No tension this time, just a cautious politeness. I nodded toward the empty seat. "Sit." We didn't talk about the will. We didn't talk about Christmas. Instead, we talked about the weather, the new coffee machine at his office, and a football game he'd watched the night before. It was small talk, but it wasn't forced. When the check came, he reached for it, and I let him take it without protest. That was new. Over the next few weeks, these accidental meetups became intentional. He'd swing by the house with a bag of groceries he'd bought too much of. Sometimes we'd have coffee on the porch. Sometimes we'd watch TV without saying much. It wasn't a floodgate opening. More like a slow, careful trickle. Then one evening, as we sat in the garage fixing an old lawn chair, he said, "You've been busy lately. Emily told me about the youth center." I shrugged. "Keeps me out of trouble." He smiled faintly, then said, "The kids there, they must really appreciate it." I looked at him, wondering if he saw the parallel, that I'd found a place where showing up still meant something. The first hint of something deeper came a week later. He called, not texted, called, to ask if I wanted to grab lunch. Over burgers, he said, "You know, I didn't realize how much time I'd let slip by. I guess I thought you'd always be there." His voice was quiet, almost drowned out by the noise of the restaurant. I didn't say, "I won't always be." He already knew. But change, I've learned, is slow. Some days, he'd call. Other days, weeks would pass. I didn't hold it against him anymore. I'd stopped counting the gaps. When you let go of the scoreboard, you stop waiting for someone to win. You just play the moments you get. One Saturday morning, we ended up at the park together. I was watching a group of kids kick a soccer ball when he asked, "Do you think it's too late?" I turned to him. "Too late for what?" He hesitated. "For me to be better at this." I didn't pretend not to know what this meant. I just shook my head. It's only too late when the ground's too hard to dig. He seemed to think about that for a long time. Later that week, Emily told me she'd seen my son drop off a box of sports equipment at the youth center. "Did you ask him to?" she said. I shook my head. "No. But I'm glad he did." I didn't ask him about it either. Some gestures are meant to be left unmeasured. By autumn, the space between us wasn't so jagged. There were still unspoken things, still wounds we hadn't named, but there was also laughter again. One afternoon, he helped me fix a loose shutter on the porch. We didn't talk about wills or inheritances. Just screws, wood, and weather. And somehow, that felt like more progress than any apology could bring. On his way out that day, he paused at the truck door. "Dad," he said, "I know I can't undo the last few years, but I don't want to waste the next ones." I didn't make a speech. I just nodded and said, "Then don't." The holidays came around again, faster than I expected. This time, he called a month in advance. "What are you making for Christmas dinner?" he asked. I laughed. Guess you'll have to show up to find out. And he did. He came early, helped peel potatoes, even untangled the lights without complaining. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. When we sat down to eat, I caught him glancing at the empty chair across from him, the one I used to stare at when he wasn't there. He didn't say anything, but I saw the weight in his eyes. Maybe he was finally starting to understand the quiet spaces he'd left behind. That night, after he left, I sat by the fire with a full stomach and a mind that wasn't restless. The will was still as I'd left it, the youth center, the donations, the gifts to people who had shown up when it mattered. I didn't change it. I didn't need to. Because the truth was, this wasn't about punishing him anymore. It was about making peace with the fact that love isn't measured in money left behind, but in moments shared while you're still here to enjoy them. Winter deepened, and with it came a stillness I'd grown to appreciate. The world outside seemed quieter under a blanket of snow, and inside, the crackle of the fire felt like old company. I've been living with this new rhythm for a while now. One where my happiness wasn't waiting on my son's next move, but found in the everyday moments I built myself. One cold afternoon, the youth center hosted its annual winter fair. I was manning the raffle booth when I saw my son walk through the door. No announcement, no fanfare. Just him, bundled in a coat, looking a little uncertain. Emily greeted him with her usual warmth and handed him a cup of hot cider. He gave me a small nod from across the room. I nodded back. For the next few hours, I watched him help the kids with the snowmen contest, laugh with the volunteers, and chat with people he'd never met before. He didn't hover around me, and I didn't hover around him. We were just two people in the same space, doing something good. And somehow, that felt like a bigger step forward than any long, emotional conversation could have. Later that night, after the fair had ended, he helped me stack chairs in the storage room. "You've done a lot here," he said quietly. "It matters." I looked at him and saw something in his eyes. Maybe pride, maybe respect. Whatever it was, I hadn't seen it in a long time. We walked out together into the snowy night. The parking lot lights cast halos on the ground, and our breath curled in the cold air. At his truck, he hesitated before getting in. "Dad," he said, "I don't know if I ever said it, but I'm sorry. For not showing up. For taking you for granted." I didn't rush to fill the space with forgiveness. I let the words sit there, real and heavy. Then I said, "Thank you. That means more than you think." And it did. More than changing the will back ever could. Over the next months, we found a balance. He still had his life, and I still had mine, but we met in the middle more often. Sunday dinners, help with house repairs, even the occasional fishing trip like we used to when he was little. They weren't grand gestures, just consistent ones. One day, while we were fixing a broken fence post, he asked, "Do you ever think about changing your will?" I stopped hammering and looked at him. "No," I said honestly. "But it's not about shutting you out anymore. It's about making sure what I leave behind helps the most people it can." He nodded, and there was no resentment in his face. Just understanding. Spring returned, and with it, the youth center garden bloomed. Kids I'd known for years were graduating, moving on, chasing futures they hadn't believed possible before. And in small ways, I knew my decision had been part of that. One evening, my son came by with a box. Inside was a framed photo. Me, him, and a group of kids from the youth center, all smiling in the sun. "Thought you might want this," he said. I hung it in the living room, right above the fireplace. It wasn't just a picture. It was proof that some things do grow back, even if they take time. As the years rolled forward, I noticed we didn't talk much about the past anymore. We didn't need to. We were building something new, one visit, one laugh, one shared task at a time. On my last birthday, he handed me a card. Inside was a single line. "Thanks for showing me what showing up really means." I kept that card on my desk, right next to my will. Both were reminders, one of the choice I'd made, and the other of what it had inspired. Looking back, I realized the inheritance I left my son wasn't the kind you can spend or sell. It was the kind you carry in your actions, the kind that shapes how you treat people when it counts. Because in the end, money fades, property changes hands, and things break. But the lesson of showing up, that's worth more than anything I could have signed over on paper. And if there's one thing I've learned as a father, it's this. Sometimes the best gift you can give your child is the chance to meet you halfway.